Great. Well, thank you very much, Anna, for the introduction. I typically decline being an expert, but I will try and fulfill that role if at all possible. First of all, a big thanks to Exeter and Prague CSD for really what I think is an absolutely fantastic event, so thank you very much. And a big thanks as well to you, the audience, today for being so early at what is actually quite an austere topic, in particular because of the after party last night. I'm going to try and cover two basic objectives in the presentation. You can see the title, Major Trends in Corporate Events, a very kind of ambitious title. So my two main objectives are, one, to try and at least give a provisional or elements of an answer to that question, what are the major trends? And the second kind of objective is really to give a little bit of information about the process in Europe, the history in Europe, about developing and implementing corporate action standards or corporate event standards. I think this is an interesting history, an interesting topic, and it's something which has had at least partial success, so I think it's worth some attention. Passing quickly through my notes. Just to start off perhaps by giving a bit of background on myself. So traditionally, as I say, I don't see myself as a technical expert in this area, but I do have some background in this area. I work for BNY Mellon in the public policy unit, so I cover for BNY Mellon as a significant custodian, significant asset manager, significant collateral manager, but also a significant asset manager. We are in particular interested in all kinds of public policy issues that relate to the custody chain, that relate to market infrastructure, including, of course, CSDs. We are also very, very interested in both regulation, of course, and self-regulation. Self-regulation meaning market standards, and we see very often the two as being complementary. So public policy work needs to work both on regulation and on self-regulation. My personal history is that I started off in this area of market standards relating to corporate actions back in around 2005, when more or less by chance I got invited to some of the work developing corporate action standards as resulting from the work to try and overcome what was then called Giovannini Barrier 3. So I started more or less in 2005, and then in 2014, perhaps the biggest commitment was to say that I became chair of what was then called the Target 2 Securities Corporate Actions subgroup, and I've continued that, chairing that group, which then became the AMISECO Corporate Events Group, which I still currently co-chair. So I have some background in these topics. But as I say, I'm not an expert, so this is just my personal view. So perhaps a challenge to the audience, if at the end of my little speech here, there's anything you disagree with, please, stand up and tell us, where I went wrong or what I have missed. So I will certainly try and give you a few minutes at the end for you to fulfill that part of the challenge. Just two kind of overarching remarks when we're talking about corporate events processing. For me, this is essentially to do with the custody chain. It's to do with what is the custody chain, what is the rationale for the custody chain. So for me, absolutely, the custody chain has a rationale. It's there to do something, okay? In one word or two words, it's there essentially to cover the many-to-many problem of connecting multiple issuers with multiple investors. So that's the kind of core rationale for the custody chain. But the custody chain has, let's say, one significant inbuilt challenge, and that's the challenge of information management. The custody chain necessarily involves multiple intermediaries, so the challenge is how do you manage information in that custody chain. Just to perhaps, I've got a very, very short presentation, so I'm going to try and use 2 slides. So with a bit of luck, here is the first slide I want to use. So this is really just to be more precise about what I mean when we're talking about corporate events and corporate event processing. Traditionally, corporate events relates to three operational processes in the custody chain. So the first one is financial corporate actions, then general meetings processing, so the proxy voting process, the process whereby investors can participate in the governance of a company through the custody chain. And then the third conventional corporate events process is the process of shareholder identification. This categorization of three processes, this is something that's currently in the European market standards. It's also in European regulation. European regulation in this area is Shareholder Rights Directive 2, and Shareholder Rights Directive 2 really builds on these three separate operational processes. Looking at the list, I think it's important to say this is actually quite a short list. There are other processes that deal with information through the custody chain. One new process we very, very briefly discussed yesterday is the process around CSDR settlement penalties, also a process of sending information up and down the custody chain, but I'm clearly not going to speak about that. But the item where I wanted to say where this list is incomplete is one big process which is part of corporate events, and that is tax, withholding tax processing. This is currently missing, and we'll come back to some of the reasons for that. My next slide is really just a quick overview of some of the history of market standards in Europe. For me, the big market standards effort started, let's say, I mentioned 2005. It was really kicked off by the Giovannini reports, which dated back to 2001, 2003, and the allocation to the industry to develop solutions to what was called Giovannini Barrier 3, relating to national differences in corporate action or corporate event processing. So that was really a regulatory push to produce some improvements in this area, and that effort resulted in around 2008, 2010 to fairly significant work on two sets of standards. One, the foundational market standards for corporate actions processing, which was a success, was endorsed, was updated in 2012, and is still the foundation for corporate actions processing across Europe. The other Giovannini process, Barrier 3 process, is general meetings. As we can see on the slide, those standards were drafted in 2010, but never fully endorsed and never really implemented. So to a certain extent, that process, I wouldn't say has completely failed, but has certainly stalled. Following Giovannini, we then had another big driver for European corporate event standards, and that was the Target 2 Securities project. And then in around 2010, 2012, we had a whole series of very, very detailed corporate action standards relating to the T2S project, how to allow T2S to function correctly and appropriately. Following Target 2 Securities, we had another broader regulatory driver, which was Shareholder Rights Directive 2. And as mentioned, Shareholder Rights Directive 2 creates a new process on shareholder identification. The industry didn't have any standards, so very simply, the industry wrote some standards, some self-regulating standards that go into more operational details for that process. And just to say, those standards have been endorsed and are implemented or being implemented and are being monitored. The next big corporate action story in Europe is what's called the SCORE standards. This really relates to another infrastructure project, the ECB's ECMS project, which is around collateral and Eurosystem collateral. For this project as well, there's also a need for a very high concordance in corporate action processing. So as a result, the ECB essentially placed a lot of pressure on market participants to write and to agree a set of standards to ensure that we get to the greatest extent possible alignment in the processing in corporate actions. For me, what does this slide say? Well, it says several things. One thing it says, actually, we have quite a lot of standards. This may be good, this may be bad. Another thing it says is it actually takes quite a lot of time to write standards. Each standard process takes a lot of time. These are difficult negotiations, difficult exercises, difficulty in getting endorsement and agreement. Perhaps the consequence is successful standards typically are driven by external pressure, typically regulatory or market infrastructure. We have standards and everybody involved, all the stakeholders sitting around the table, agree on standards because there is some kind of external pressure pushing them to do that. Perhaps another lesson from this list is really the standards on general meetings. General meetings are particularly difficult and significantly more difficult than financial corporate actions. And I think that's to do with the fact that they are much more wide-ranging. They cover governance, they cover a whole set of issues, concerns, sensitivities that go well beyond the fairly limited sensitivities around financial corporate actions. And as mentioned, another big lesson from this standard list is tax is even more difficult than general meetings. We haven't really started work on tax standards. But nonetheless, as mentioned, we do have standards. So to try and answer the basic question of today's session, what are the major trends? I thought it's useful to have a look at what exactly is embodied in the current set of corporate action standards. So here's just a list of some of the themes which I do feel are embodied. First thing to say is all the standards are really around making the custody chain work, making information move end to end in the custody chain. The end-to-end aspect is very, very important, and it actually means that the standards process needs involvement from all stakeholders from the end-to-end process. Most of the standards embody one particular principle, which is really the principle of golden operational source or golden operational record, meaning one source of common authoritative information for an event. This is something we talked about yesterday a little bit, but I'll also add to that one other element, which is a principle of one validation. If we get new information into the custody chain, what we actually want is for that information to be validated once and not at every level of the custody chain. Another very, very important principle, of course, and this is perhaps self-evident, is we need automation, we need SDP communication through the custody chain. Without that, none of these processes really work. One difficult, sensitive topic which very often comes in standards discussions is the question of whether it's possible to have communication outside the custody chain. Can issuers, for example, communicate directly with investors? And I think very often in the standards, this is not a priority. The standards typically don't prohibit it if it's possible, but really the point of the standards is to make the custody chain work so that at least the custody chain does provide that communication. And perhaps one final theme, which I think is very, very important for the future, and that final theme is the fact that the standards today focus very much about only passing necessary information through the custody chain. Very often today, the standards, but as well our infrastructure, and including Target 2 securities, for example, as a key element of our infrastructure, doesn't want too much information. It just wants that information which is necessary for processing. I think this is an important consideration for the future. Just a quick overview from a kind of big pan-European perspective. This entire standards process has been, in particular with respect to financial corporate actions, it has been a success. Clearly not a complete success, and there's still work to be done, but the overall evaluation is that Europe has made significant progress in this area. In the list of successes, In next place would probably come shareholder identification. This is a new set of standards, less mature, but as well, significant progress has been made, even though, clearly, there are still some significant outstanding issues. Next in the list, of course, is general meetings, and they're clearly less progress. That, for me, is really kind of where we are. So the question really is, what do we need in the future? What are the big themes? What are the big trends of the future? And I want to set out three core trends. I want to talk about governance. So governance issues. This is and will continue to be important in the future. A second core trend for the future is transparency. And a third core trend for the future inevitably has to be tax. Just to say a few words about these three things. Governance clearly ties in with the broader regulatory agenda around stewardship, around you as an investor taking responsibility for your investments, participating in the life of companies. So what that actually means is that market infrastructure, intermediaries, the custody chain has to offer solutions which allow this process to work. Part of the problem about this process is that parts of the general meeting process actually do work quite well, but clearly other parts work less well. And I kind of think that collectively we have a responsibility for the entire process to work. It's not simply enough to say, our little piece works, therefore we can wash our hands of it. No, I think collectively we need to ensure that the entire process works end to end, in part because of the broader political drivers. Another big theme going forward, I think, is transparency. I mentioned that the custody chain, market infrastructure, we don't want too much information. What that actually means is that a good part of the custody chain, for people looking at it from the outside, they see the custody chain as a black box. They're never quite certain what is happening in it. As a major custodian, we say, guys, don't worry, we're regulated, we're supervised, we're in control, we know what's happening. But I think the reality of the perception that it is a black box is something we need to think about. And of course, the other reality is because there's limited information in the custody chain, we do not know everything, and not all information is available at every level. So in short, I think we need more transparency, but this is kind of a foundational point. It will affect many of our processes, corporate event processing, but actually also settlement processing, and it will affect core infrastructure processing. I raise this as an issue. I don't in any way say I have the answers on this. Just to talk about the third big theme, which is tax. Tax is even more of a black hole. The little history of the story of when we looked at corporate action standards in the past, corporate action standards very, very explicitly said, we are not covering tax. T2S corporate action standards in around 2010, and I was in some of those meetings, we deliberately took the decision of saying, we're not going to cover tax, and that text is in the current T2S corporate action standards. Because tax is too complicated, we won't be able to give answers. But yesterday we heard from Jesus Benito saying tax is the biggest single obstacle to cross-CSD links, and of course he's absolutely right. From a BNY Mellon custodian bank perspective, tax is the big operational burden. It's the big process where we have hundreds of thousands, millions of pieces of paper, where delays are incredible, where there is great uncertainty. So we definitely know that tax is something where we need to make progress. A specific point on the tax, I personally believe that we don't necessarily need to build a completely separate, efficient tax process. The way forward, from my perspective, is very much about integrating tax processing into corporate action processing. So I see that as kind of an objective and as a way forward, rather than creating two separate processes which may have their own inconsistencies and contradictions. So that's kind of my quick list of three broad themes. I just want to kind of conclude by just setting out a quick list of challenges. Just a tiny technical point on a theoretical challenge. And the theoretical challenge in corporate event processing is the contradiction between, or the tension between, a record date approach and a trading date approach. In most of our corporate action standards, these standards are built on a record date approach. It's built on the idea that the source, the driver of processing, is the position on record date at the CSD, is based on the settled position at the CSD. And we do that because CSDs, intermediaries in the custody chain, we can see those positions. We know what they are. They're secure, certain, they're within our control. The other approach is really a trading date approach. And the challenge with the trading date approach is that it depends on the trading relationship between two investors, and that trading relationship could be anywhere in the world, could be formalized in very, very different format agreements. Intermediaries, CSDs, we're not really aware of these trading relationships, and that's why the trading date approach is a challenge for us. So as I say, our standards are very much built around record date approach, but I just want to highlight that there are two big areas where the record date approach runs into problems. One is with respect to tax authorities. Tax authorities are interested in who has been doing the trading, who really is the beneficial owner, because they want the tax to apply to the beneficial owner. It doesn't matter who holds the securities, who really is receiving the income. And the other big tension is collateral and collateral management, because almost by definition, we want the processing to be appropriate for the collateral giver and not for the record date holder, namely the collateral receiver. Quick challenge is messaging standards. Messaging standards, of course, is necessary for the communication to go through correctly through the custody chain. I won't say any more on that challenge because Jean-Paul will follow me and I'm sure will say much better than I can on this topic. Quick, since I'm out of time, quick mention on standards. Standards, it's great writing standards, but there also has to be compliance with the standards. So we also need some kind of mechanism to encourage compliance. I think in Europe, we spent a lot of time and effort on that, and we have, I won't say fully effective, but at least we've put in place some of the measures to try and encourage and put pressure on people to comply. So that's a big topic. My final challenge, and it's a challenge but also an opportunity, is with respect to new technology. If I say that fundamentally we're talking about information management in the custody chain, of course, and for example, we're talking about the tension between record date and trade date. Well, in fact, the answer to much of this is improved information management. And of course, the great hope of new technology is that it can improve this information management. Just to really conclude and to come back to my challenge, I mean, fundamentally, I'm optimistic in this area. I think we've made a lot of progress in this area. We're aware of many of the existing outstanding challenges. So I'm optimistic. I'm also very aware that the custody chain, our markets, our capital markets, are global markets. It makes no sense if Europe has one specific way of doing things and other areas of the world have a different way of doing things. So I definitely agree that in this whole area, it's important that Europe moves out from a purely European perspective and takes in a broader global perspective. Perhaps just a side comment here, I'm very appreciative of the work of ISA in this area, because ISA does try and take that global perspective, so that's very, very valuable. I'll perhaps stop there, and I'm not sure if I have a minute or two for questions, but if I do, I would like to throw it out to the audience and ask everybody here who's been listening very patiently, what have I missed? What else should be said? Thank you very much.